today's Lunch and Learn webinar on the really hot topic of shifting safety culture in big businesses. My name is Marc McLaren and I'm the Managing Director of Generative HSE, and it's great to have you join us this afternoon. So I hope you've managed to find yourself a cup of tea or coffee, that you're allowed to eat your sandwich at the desk. We're just waiting for a few people to join, and then we'll get going. Generative HSE, for those who don't know, has been around now for just over 5 years, and our primary focus has been working with organisations to build their capacity to change their leadership and their culture, and through that to actually align their safety management systems. So we have a few more people about to join, so I'll pause there and then we'll make a start. The way that it will work this afternoon is I'll present for about 30 minutes. There's opportunity you'll find on your panel there that you can ask questions, and I'll be able to see your questions as we go, and I'll pause and either answer them during the presentation or otherwise I'll come back at the end. So we'll go for about 30 minutes, and then at the end there'll be an opportunity for questions. I appreciate that means you'll need to type those questions. Because we've got so many people online today, it's much easier to do that than have people ask questions, because often you get a distortion in the quality of sound during the webinar. So I'll give people 2 minutes and we'll make a start. Well, welcome to our Lunch and Learn seminar series being hosted by Generative HSE. This afternoon we're tackling what's a really vexed issue of big business and how you go about changing your safety culture. It's something that really has exercised my thinking and that of our team really for the last nearly 20 years. And even more so as organisations become more dispersed, they are complex in operations. And when I say complex, often the risks in that organisation are emerging. But the good news is that there has been a lot of research done going way back to pre-1985. There was an Israeli researcher called Dov Zohar who really started the movement in thinking about safety culture. And certainly, as I said, it's a vexed issue, and we'll go about this afternoon. It's also, you could say, somewhat of a issue that's under debate. So in terms of making a start, here we go. So what I want to talk about is how do you fundamentally go about changing a safety culture in a big business. And for a number of you, you're well aware that it's not just simply a matter of saying we're going to do things differently around here. Fundamentally, it really is about having a long-term strategy, and most importantly is having the capability of leadership to be able to deliver against that strategy. So let me unpick what that might look like, and in doing that I thought it'd be helpful to talk firstly about this idea of culture. You know, what exactly is it? So in terms of the presentation, we're going to tackle a couple of big issues. So that is firstly about what is safety culture, and fundamentally, you know, is it any different to organisational culture? And I will cover that. The other thing that's important from a leadership perspective, and particularly about strategy, is it malleable? In other words, can leaders actually do things in order to positively influence safety culture? And in doing that, does that really change an organisation's performance around safety? And when I'm talking about performance around safety, what I'm looking at is not only a reduction in injury or harm, but also about how does an organisation go about creating success? How does it go about building positives in that safety space? And I suppose in tackling that, what I'd like to talk about this afternoon is what drives or blocks change. Because I think if we can be clear about that, particularly in the context of what we're talking about today, a large organisation that probably is spread over multiple sites, has a large number of people. When I say large, I'm thinking, more than sort of 300, 400, 500 people. And then in that context, what are the steps that can be taken to actually change the culture? And that's where we'll sort of finish up in today's webinar. So what do we actually mean? Let's put under the sort of the microscope, under that magnifying glass, what do we mean by the term culture? It's a term that often gets thrown around in organisations, so what do we really mean by it? And I want to say to you, and it comes from a guy called Spencer Oatey, and I think it's actually a really helpful way of thinking about culture, is that really culture is a fuzzy set. It's not something that's hard and fast and concrete. I think it's helpful to see it's a fuzzy set of attitudes, beliefs, behaviours. Okay, conventions is just really about the way things need to be done, and assumptions, and really importantly, it's the values shared by the wider group. A lot of the time we go astray when we think about trying to shift safety culture, particularly in a large organisation, when we lose sight of the fact that we are referring to the collective whole or the subcultures. I'm not just talking about the CEO's view about safety, the executive, a frontline leader. It's really about that sort of deep sort of held value or set of beliefs that an organisation has, in this case, in regard to safety. And the other thing I think is helpful about this definition, it's really about then how that actually influences people in that organisation in terms of the decisions that they make. Sometimes we just focus on behaviour. I want to suggest to you this afternoon, if we really are committed to changing culture, we have to fundamentally think about decisions. And in thinking about decisions, we have to move backwards and say, how does that wider workforce then understand or make meaning of those decisions and other people's behaviour? So in terms of then thinking about it, let's actually sort of drill down and have a look a little bit more closely then at about culture. Because there are three very different ways of thinking about culture. And if you want to sort of read some more, you'll be aware, probably a number of you, that the Safety Institute of Australia is the custodian of the OHS body of knowledge. And there is an excellent chapter in there about organisational culture and the debate about that in regard to safety culture. Is it different? How do you go about changing it? So one of the things I want to suggest to you, it really depends when you come to this discussion, is what sort of viewpoint do you bring? So some will come with a sociological view of culture. So what they'll say is it's really about what the culture is, okay? So it's how it expresses itself. And so in that sociological view, so it's really the rather than is, okay? It's important that we get our concept around that. And so what happens there is really, in a sociological point of view, we're really trying to understand and describe the culture rather than evaluate or measure it. So we're looking primarily at the past. So we look back into how things have happened, and we really are taking a qualitative, so it's really about the stories that people tell. So often it's about what we call in sociological terms an ethnographic study. People become embedded in the organisation and they look at how that organisation operates, and that's really from a sociological perspective. We can also look at it from an organisational psychology view, and that's really about something that the organisation is, or we look at its attributes. So if I'm taking that view of culture, I'm really looking at the focus on the present, what's happening at this point in time, and you'll see a number of models that will describe then safety culture in terms of dimensions. A really helpful model in this school is the NOSAC 50 out of the Nordic countries, and that's a 7-dimensional model that measures an organisational safety culture, and what they're actually looking at is rather more climate. So it's about the perceptions of safety, the procedure, and management's commitment. And then there's a third view, and many of us actually probably find ourselves unwittingly, if you like, subscribing to this view. This is the view of pragmatics. And so really this is not so much about empirical research, it's more about a person's experience and their judgment that they exercise. And so what tends to happen is we describe or declare a future state. And that state talks about how we will function in regard to safety. And often we'll talk about work practices, people's behaviour, their values, their commitments, etc. And so very much it's about a framework of how work will be done and by whom. And the reason why I say unwittingly, because many of us will be aware of the Hudson model, or sometimes it's called the safety culture maturity model, you know, where it starts looking at culture being pathological, reactive, calculative, proactive, and then generative. Well, that actually is a pragmatic view. And so the idea then is what happens is that leadership in a large business paints an attractive future focus and says, this is where we want to be as an organisation. And I want to suggest to you that part of thinking about how you go about shifting a safety culture is you certainly need this sociological and organisational psychology model to understand. But in order to change, I want to suggest to you this afternoon that really that's primarily about adopting a pragmatic view. So if you think about then, how do we change culture? And I suppose often I hear in boardrooms and with senior executive, they'll say, look, I'm looking for what are the levers that I need to pull. Or sometimes people will say, you know, I know there's no silver bullet, but what do I need to do in order to change something? All I want to say is we just need to exercise here really some caution. I believe that there are levers, but I don't think in a large organisation it's simply the task of identifying what are 2 or 3 things we're going to change over the next 12 months, and that will somehow, as it were, radically transform our safety culture and therefore our safety performance. It's much more nuanced than that, and really what we need to be focusing on is the complexity of the things that are connected, which is what I want to talk about. So if you think about change then, in a large organisation, we really have to basically embrace 3 simultaneous approaches. And I think if you only adopt 1 or 2 of the 3, my view from both experience and also research, you will probably fail in changing the safety culture. And when you embrace these 3 approaches, you have to embrace it consistently, and you have to embrace it, I want to suggest to you, over a 3 to 5 year period. So there's a top-down focus where basically your board, your CEO, your COO, your executive management team, your general managers, your middle managers, who often get left out in this equation, need to be able to describe what it is that they're going to commit to in the first case. Secondly, what they are going to invite people to be part of. And then thirdly, in a top-down approach, what resources is that senior group of decision makers going to ultimately make available to the business? It's also bottom-up. So it's really about a grassroots movement. So it's about fundamentally shifting our focus and seeing here, and I'm going to come back to this towards the end of today's webinar, but it's really seeing that people are the solution. So often in safety we see it as people are the problem. You know, really, we'd have a whole lot better safety if we didn't have human error. I want to suggest to you that is really the upside down view of the world. What we need to do, if you're going to facilitate a grassroots bottom up, we need to be very clear about communicating to people that in this engagement piece, we view you, we treat you, we treasure you as a solution. And then finally, together, if you want to change culture in a big business, you have to be able to paint a compelling picture of what things will look like in the next 1, 3 and 5 year period. So where to start? So let's roll up our sleeves and say, well, look, okay, that's all very good, Mark. That's probably fairly intuitive, makes sense. So where do you start? Well, I want to suggest to you in this webinar, there are 6 places to start. The first thing is, you might recall I said that we need to look at culture from a sociological and psychological point of view. So the first place, and organisations often skip this, and it's to their peril, you need to establish a baseline reading. And that baseline reading needs to be not only about what we're not doing well. It has to be about what are we doing in terms of success. Because organisations that are going to change their safety culture fundamentally have to work on a strengths-based model, which means you need to identify what you're doing well and then how you build on that. So that's the first step. And there are a number of tools that are available that you as an organisation can use. The other one I suggest to you, you don't need to go and survey everyone in the organisation. You probably need to look at a sample size depending upon the complexity of your organisation, somewhere between 20 to 30% to get a reliable read. And you also have to be very careful that the questions that are asked are not preemptive in a point of view of provoking an expected or a desired result, because that will distort your strategy. The second thing you need to be able to do is really to go and embed yourself in the business. And what I mean by that is, and people will be aware of Eric Holnagel's work, where he's talked about this notion of productive or safety to safety. You really need to understand what's the difference between the way work is imagined, WAI, and work as done. Because if you want to change culture in a big business and you ignore work practices, then you will fail to change the culture. You can have the best program, you can have the very best in leaders doing briefing sessions, you can have hearts and minds, you can talk to people till you're blue in the face about what's your top 5 values or commitments. If you ignore this, you will not change culture. And certainly there's been some fairly interesting writings just recently. Andrew Hopkins is one of those people, reflecting on what happened in Macondo, Deepwater Horizon in Mexico, focusing on the fact that there was fundamentally a gap not understood. The next thing you have to think about, I think if you want to change culture, is what's driving disengagement. So what's in driving engagement and what's disengaging? And fundamentally, that will come out of the difference between work as imagined and done, because often if that gap grows, the way we tend to manage it is we bureaucratise it. Okay, we create more layers of complexity. And in the end, people see no value proposition, and so therefore they move away from what you're trying to achieve, they become disengaged, and again, no matter what sort of strategic plan you've got, you will struggle to change the culture. Then you need to focus on a pragmatic, and I've used that word purposely, strategic plan. It has to be pragmatic, and what I mean by that is, firstly, it has to be compelling, it has to be measurable, and most importantly, it has to be able to be delivered. I don't know about you, but I have sat in so many planning sessions in my career, and I've looked at what's been put together and I go, there's no commitment to the resources required to make that happen. If you do that, you will go back to the point above, you will drive disengagement because you will create an expectation that you're not going to deliver on. The next step I want to suggest to you is you really need to think about aligning and engaging all leadership layers. All too often, where I've seen organisations that are large fail in changing their culture is they forgot about middle management. They've spent all their time focusing on the strategic piece at the senior level. They're focused on their frontline leaders, and they somehow, I don't know, they just forgot about their middle managers. Middle managers in any organisation are the interpreters. They are the ones who, in a sense, explain. They put it into a tactical picture. So if you want to change, you need to engage that middle layer. And then the last thing I want to suggest to you about where to start is we have to explain the why, not just the what. Because what happens is we often are very good about telling people what's right, what they need to do, but we don't explain the why. And here we're trying to, in a sense, to change adults. So let's move on then. Oops, we've gone backwards. Okay, so what I want to suggest to you then is something about research. There are a couple of things that research has told us in regard to changing culture. So this is not, in a sense, my view. This is what has come out of the research. There are 5 things. Firstly, organisation and safety culture are one of the same. So don't waste any breath. If you find people going, there's no difference between the two, just simply say yes and move on. The research is very clear on that. And all we're doing is, when we're talking about safety culture, is we're really talking about the work practices in the organisation and the output or the outcome of safety. The second thing is it's really important to see that behaviour is not just shaped by culture. I'll say that again. Behaviour is not just shaped by culture. It's actually shaped by leadership, which obviously is connected to culture, and it's also shaped in terms of having an enabling system that supports people. The other thing that's come out of a lot of the recent research in terms of safety differently is recognising that there's always a gap, and it's called performance variability in an organisation. In other words, we can't proceduralise everything in an organisation. So what's important is we need to understand that variability, and we need to, where appropriate, and particularly when it relates to critical safety risks, we need to then understand even more and probably dampen the variability. The other thing we need to focus on is the fact that leaders actually set a reciprocal tone. So you cannot roll out, and I've seen this happen, and in lots of organisations, we're going to change culture, and we're going to go and we're going to run a culture program for our employees. You will only change it when leaders set an example of commitment, because what will happen is that, and it comes out of the research of systems theory, people will then want to reciprocate, and you want to create this reciprocating tone, not of obligation, but of meeting commitments. And then finally, if you leave bureaucracy unchecked, it will drive counterintuitive behaviours. So let's move on and say, okay, what are the safety culture change promoters? And so I've given a fair bit of thought about to this and thought, what can you fundamentally do? And in a sense, what does the research tell us? Well, the first thing is it's really about perceived, and that's the important word, leadership commitment. So I just talked about the leaders setting a reciprocal tone. That tone is really based on the aspect of a displayed or an understood commitment. The second area is really where there's mutual trust. So we need to look at how do you build trust. And if we continue to sort of treat people as merely people who conform to a set of procedures within a system, whether it be a safe work method statement, whether it be a JSA, whether it be a risk assessment, we need to go beyond that and work out how do we fundamentally build trust, and it has to be mutual. The next area is really interesting. It's really about restorative justice. It is inevitable that things will fail in organisations. So the issue here is really about how do you build a restorative justice that restores that and goes beyond just and fair. One of the things that will absolutely undermine the change of a culture around safety in an organisation is where we actually talk the rhetoric of just and fair, but it's not displayed. So I want to suggest to you, Sidney Deck has written some really interesting work just recently on restorative justice, and also a guy in the States called Todd Conklin's been talking about it. So put that into your Google engine and have a look after today's webinar, because I actually think just and fair is probably falling short. And then finally, what's really important is we need to create meaningful work practices. In other words, where people can engage in work that is meaningful, that adds to their sense of both success and physical and mental well-being. And you're probably well aware there's a really large discussion taking place at the moment, within the workplace health and safety community about the importance not just of physical health but of mental health. So I want to suggest if you want to change culture, first and foremost, it begins with leaders showing and displaying a commitment that is understood. And that's why I've got the word there, perceived. It doesn't really matter whether I can tell you as an executive, I'm committed to safety. What matters is how that is interpreted in the organisation. Secondly, it's about trust. Thirdly, it's about justice that restores. And then finally, it's about meaningful work practices that promote both success and well-being in the workplace. And that is fundamentally what should be on our radar when we're trying to change. And if we were just to work on those four things consistently, I would suggest to you over probably a 12 to 24 month, you will fundamentally shift your safety culture and your performance. And remember, when I use the word performance, I'm talking both about reducing harm and also promoting success. So let's think about work the plan. So what are the things to work the plan? Well, the first thing is I want to suggest to you we need to go and ask a different set of questions. Remember I said we need to embed ourselves in the business and understand work as imagined versus work as done. Well, when we do that, we need to ask a different set of questions. So often what happens when we talk about safety, it's what's done to people. I'm going to go and do an observation on you. I'm going to tell you what is safe and unsafe. I want to suggest you want to change culture, you've got to do it from the inside out. Sidney Decker wrote a really interesting book called Drift to Failure that's recently out, and also his book Safety Differently. And he's talked about so often what we do when we try and change culture, it's down and in. He's actually argued, and I think it's a great argument, well worth a read, it's about going up and out. And up and out is asking questions about resources and tools. It's engaging people in that Socratic questioning of inquiry. It's about strategies that set people up for success. And it's about understanding how people are managing the constraints and controls. So that's the first one I suggest to you about work the plan. Second thing is, you're not going to do this alone. I mean, some of you probably on today's webinar have a role either as a senior HSE person in your organisation, maybe you are a specialist advisor, maybe you're an operational manager. We're only going to change when we enlist culture advocates. And so it's really important that we find the early adopters and we actively sponsor them as they seek to influence others. And then finally, we need to think about micro-experiments. So when we identify in this gap between the way work is imagined and done, and we've used this different set of questions that we're asking people, is then to sponsor micro-experiments, to change things and to see what impact that has upon the culture. Now, I'm suggesting micro-experiments need to be bold. Okay, there's no point tinkering at the edge. And secondly, micro-experiments need to be safe. So you don't want to put people in harm's way, but also you want to be able to test a hypothesis or an idea that's come out of your culture advocates and see whether that, as it were, begins to shift the culture. And that will move you, I want to suggest to you, filling in the jigsaw puzzle. Well, we're coming towards the end of today's webinar, so I want to suggest to you it's fundamentally, in changing culture, it's putting jigsaw pieces together. And hopefully I've begun in our brief half hour to try and at least identify some of the main jigsaw puzzles. And the idea is when we get them right, we get the thumbs up. And you know what, that thumbs up comes from leaders in their organisation. But I want to suggest to you the most important thumbs up is not what a leader gives his thumbs up to or her. It is people in the organisation. So here are 3 principles. If you want to change culture, and I know several organisations around the globe who have committed to these 3 principles, and they are doing some remarkable things in terms of changing culture. So the first is fundamentally it's a paradigm shift. So the shift is really about people are the solution, not the problem. So really this is getting at the heart of embracing people's ability to create, to innovate, to take ownership and to be engaged. The second principle is really trying to get people to shift to seeing safety not just as some sort of hearts and minds, you know, and I'm sorry if I've upset a few people in the behavioural school, but look, really, you know, it's sort of telling people, you know, you've got to be committed to safety. I have a problem because most people I talk to when they rock up to work go, I start with a commitment of not harming myself or harming anybody else. So let's just take it that we've already got a heart and mind commitment. Let's shift it to an ethical practice. It's about ethics. It's about living our values. And it's not about an empty bureaucratic activity. And, you know, when I say bureaucratic activity, that's all that sort of stuff that sadly we as health and safety professionals have allowed to grow up over the years. It's become meaningless. It's become compliance-centric. It's tick and flick. And what it does, every time we allow that to go on in our culture, what we've done is we've just diminished ethical accountability and responsibilities around safety. And then the last principle I want to suggest to you this afternoon is really safety is the presence of success. It's actually not the absence of negatives. Okay, it's okay to count things, and it's okay to look at some form of a frequency rate, whether it be total recordable injuries, lost time injuries. I mean, but that doesn't really move you forward. What moves you forward is identifying out of the 10,000 times, and most likely in most organisations, in that 9,999 times it goes well, what's that success about? How can I promote that success? When you start to do that, you start to shift the culture because you're actually using a strength-based change model. And the other thing is, you see, if you think about, if you just focus on the absence of negatives, it leaves you down a rabbit warren of a very narrow view of human error. And when you have that narrow view of human error, you will tend to over-rely on hindsight bias when an incident's happened. My view is that incidents, failures, happen out of normal work. And, you know, a lot of the time it goes well, and sometimes it doesn't. And that's when we really need to get the engagement to understand. That's when restorative justice is absolutely critical. So I want to thank you for joining today's webinar, and you can join and continue the conversation. We've got a lot of really useful resources about the things I've talked about this afternoon in the webinar on our website, and you're free. You know, go and download them, share them with people, and also you can see there is our telephone number. So what I'd like to do is to open up and see if there are any questions, because you've been great. You've listened for the last just on half an hour. So I want to throw it open to the floor and see if you've got any questions before we close out today's webinar. So can I encourage you to get those fingers onto the keyboard, and I'm happy, you know, if you fundamentally disagree with what I've put forward today, hey, by all means, please disagree. I won't, by the way, name you. So if you put up a comment there and you go, Mark, that's a crock of, that's okay. But if you've got a question, once again, I won't name you. I'll try and do my best to answer your question. Also, too, you'll find sometimes I appreciate people sort of just finishing off their lunch, and you'll want to rush to that sort of 1 o'clock appointment. So that's okay if you need to do that. You're free to give me a call on the phone number, and I'm happy to have a conversation with you with the things that I've talked about this afternoon. So any questions? Don't let me off lightly. Last week's webinar on contractor and contractor management, it generated a lot of questions for Brett Wood, and I think he did a fantastic job in answering those questions. So if there are any questions, please, by all means, feel free to ask me a question, and I'll see if I can try and answer it. The other thing I was going to suggest, just while anyone's sort of thinking about a question to ask me, is that there are some great books, and I know that I've mentioned a couple of them, so I might just slow down and mention some of the books that I've mentioned and some people that are really worthwhile reading. One is a person by the name of Frank Guilderman. Great name, spelled G-U-L-D-E-N-M-U-N-D, Guilderman. And he's written some really interesting stuff. He comes out of the Delft University in the Netherlands. He works alongside, he's a colleague of Patrick Hudson, who came up with the safety model, the maturity model. If you Google him, you'll find that he's actually written some really good stuff that I've drawn on today. The other person is obviously Eric Holnagel, and his latest book on Safety 1 to Safety 2, I think is a great read and really sort of expands on some of the concepts that I've touched on today. Another person who's written some really interesting books just recently on these topics and has been a prolific writer is Professor Sidney Dekker at Griffith University. And Sidney, a couple of books that he's recently written that I think are very helpful about what we've talked about. One is in regard to, it's actually called Safety Differently. Another book that he's written that's been really, I think, revolutionary, and a number of the critics have given it the thumbs up, is Drift to Failure. And I think it's called the Field Guide to Human Error, is another book that's well worth having a look at. So I'll just go back and see if there are any questions that you want to ask, and I can see one there, so let me see if I can get that. So someone's actually asked me that they recently had a fatality at their work site, and obviously there's been an investigation, and I respect that that is probably been a very difficult thing for all involved, both the family of the person who lost their life, their colleagues, and management. But there's a view the person's raised, which I think is a very good question. It's still a view, it won't happen to me here. So it's almost like, well, it happened to that person, and often what we do that because we want to rationalise it. So we say it happened to that person because they were inexperienced, or it happened to that person because they took a shortcut, or it happened to that person because they don't have the same expertise I have. And so one of the things I think that really helps break through this is to actually get people to understand that when a fatality occurs, it happens out of normal work. And so it's not necessarily just about someone's personal failing. And the other thing about really getting people engaged with this is really being very clear about, and this particular incident, by the way, was in regard to a forklift incident. So where I would start beginning to change the culture there is really having a conversation around the critical controls, how well they're understood, particularly in that gap between the work as imagined versus work as done. And that would be a fascinating conversation to have with people, because my view is you'll find a whole lot of things that happen that people go, yes, that's all documented, but given the demands of work. And another interesting person who's written about this is a guy called Rasmussen, and he talks about 3 boundaries of workload, economic and safety. And so there's always a push towards efficiency and financial benefit. So I think a really helpful conversation in regard to this is really all about the critical controls and actually thinking in regard to how they can be more effectively managed. So I'll also, someone's asked me about the names of the authors. So what I'll do is Christy, who's our business development and client services manager, what I might do just to make it easy, I'll ask Christy to email out to everybody that reading list of material. And if anyone's struggling to find copies of things, look, by all means, please let me know. We have an extensive library at Generative HSE, and also I'm a part-time researcher at UTS, so very happy to share resources, and so people can engage in this ongoing conversation. Well, it's almost 1 o'clock in terms of daylight saving time. It might be a different time wherever you're listening, or you might be listening to it another time, because what will happen is this webinar has been recorded and it will be uploaded onto the Generative HSE website. So if you found it helpful, what we've talked about today, by all means feel free to share today's presentation. You know, really the meat of the substance has only been half an hour, so you can share that with a colleague, and very happy to engage in a further conversation. So thank you very much for joining, and this will cause an end to today's webinar. Thank you.